Hey guys, welcome back to Self-Care Haven. So today I wanted to make a video that was an excerpt from my new book, and it's a section called Distinguishing Between an Invalidating and Validating Therapist. So if you are a narcissistic abuse survivor, you know that many mental health professionals unfortunately do not know enough about narcissistic abuse and the covert manipulation tactics that abusers use. Now, I'm very, very grateful that I have connected this year with several therapists who are working on this issue, and some of them are actually featured in my book. If you're reading my book or you have read my book, you know that I've interviewed Andrea Schneider, and she is a wonderful advocate for victims of narcissistic abuse. And there's also other therapists like Shannon Thomas and Michelle Mallon, and these are all amazing powerhouse therapists who really are very well versed in narcissistic abuse, and they're just wonderful, empathic individuals, and they're very validating. And I wish that every survivor could meet a validating counselor who could help guide them on their journey. But I know that many of you will unfortunately encounter counselors who may not be as validating. Now, whether or not they even know about narcissistic abuse is not entirely the issue. It is a huge part of the issue, but it's also a whole other set of issues that can start to create this conflict between the therapist and the victim, and can sometimes even further re-traumatize the victim. So I want to share my thoughts on distinguishing between a validating therapist and an invalidating one. So I'll be reading from some of the distinctions that I've put in my book, and this is a section called Distinguishing Between an Invalidating versus Validating Therapist. The first one is when you're talking about an abusive incident with your counselor, an invalidating therapist would probably start to draw attention to the things you did or said before the abusive incident, almost implying as if you were to blame for the abuse. Now, they may unintentionally or even intentionally, there are some, unfortunately, narcissistic counselors out there who may gaslight you into believing that your issues are at the root rather than narcissistic abuse. For example, and this is very common because some counselors don't understand the covert manipulation tactics such as triangulation. For example, if they're pointing out that you should work on your jealousy issues, if you're bringing up infidelity, or perhaps a gut instinct that you have, or discrepancies about stories that your partner has told you. And they will point to your jealousy issues rather than the fact that your partner may be triangulating you or may be manufacturing jealousy, or may just be a jerk, honestly. A validating therapist, on the other hand, will empathize with your pain. They'll validate whatever you're experiencing, and they will make sure to address both the internal hooks as well as obstacles that are in the way of detaching from your partner. They'll provide a more balanced perspective that acknowledges any type of manipulative behavior that might be ongoing and chronic, while also acknowledging that there may be insecurities that may be re-triggered in the abusive cycle, but that does not discount the abuse itself. The second point I would like to mention is that an invalidating therapist will continually ask you to focus on your own behavior and take accountability for staying in the relationship. Now, I have no problem with a counselor telling a victim, like, well, we should always take accountability, we should always own our agency. But at the same time, this invalidating therapist will probably refuse to validate how difficult it is to actually extricate yourself from an abusive partner. And they may say invalidating things like, but you choose to stay, without really acknowledging factors like the trauma repetition cycle, trauma bonding, financial dependence, having children with the abuser. They need to acknowledge that there are going to be factors that make it harder for you to leave. And they should hopefully know more about trauma bonding and should be able to express how difficult it can be, while also expressing that they have faith in your agency and your ability to take control of your life. And a validating mental health professional would focus less on the fact that you stay and more on the fact on how to best support you during this time. They'll focus more on how they can support you rather than judge you. And they'll tailor resources that will help empower you to leave, or at the very least understand the signs of abuse, so you can begin to start the process of detaching from your abuser. Hopefully, a validating counselor will have information about antisocial personality disorder and narcissistic personality disorder that they can point you to if they think that your partner has been acting in ways and expressing himself or herself in ways that are suggestive of this disorder. A counselor who is invalidating will often demonstrate no solid understanding about the effects of trauma. This is very important, and actually I'll leave a link to one of the articles that my dear friend Lily from Healing from Complex Trauma and PTSD and CPTSD has written, and it's about how do you know if a counselor is trauma informed, and I'll leave that link below so you can read more about the questions you should ask in order to understand if a counselor is trauma informed. So a counselor who's invalidating will demonstrate often no solid understanding of the effects of trauma, and they will consider emotional psychological abuse as a normal relationship problem that both partners need to resolve together, and that is a major red flag, because if you're expressing that this person has been abusive to you in any way, it's not a normal relationship problem that needs to be worked through. And no validating counselor should treat it as such. Counselors who truly understand the complexities of emotional and psychological abuse are able to acknowledge that any form of abuse is unacceptable and can be very detrimental to the victim, whether it's emotional, psychological, financial, spiritual, or physical. They don't necessarily have to interfere directly in their clients' lives or overstep boundaries in order to acknowledge that this is abuse. And an invalidating counselor will often show an urgency or an attitude that signals to you that you have to let it go whenever you start to bring up any flashbacks or ruminations over the abuse, whereas a trauma-informed counselor knows that this form of psychological manipulation and emotional abuse is just as difficult to get over, if not more, than physical abuse. And no matter how small an incident may seem to an outsider, because what is often happening is that a smaller trauma will set off a chain of bigger traumas that have happened in the victim's life, whether it has anything to do with her abuser, his or her abuser or not. Trauma-informed counselors know that an abusive relationship can take a toll on your sense of self-worth and your perceived agency. So they know that traumas, no matter how small they might appear to be to them, it's still going to be something that a victim still has to deal with and still has to process and should be able to talk about in a safe space with a counselor. Another one is an invalidating counselor will question whether the motives of the narcissistic partner are malicious and intentional, despite the fact that the partner has already been told that their behavior is unacceptable, is hurtful, and they still continue to inflict that behavior. They may even show sadistic pleasure in it. And instead, the counselor may try to seem very neutral, and I understand why they do this. At the same time, I think that sometimes emotional neutrality can harm and re-traumatize victims of extreme abuse because, and I'll put another link below because Lily has written some amazing articles on this, and I want to share her work with you guys if you haven't read it already. She has another amazing article that I share in my book, which is about how neutrality, emotional neutrality, can really suck the life out of the victim who's trying to gain empathy and validation and compassion from his or her counselor. So while it's important to try to stay more of an observer rather than someone who's caught up in the situation of the client, I also think as a survivor, you really want that compassion. You want that empathy from that counselor who's hearing about your accounts of abuse. And a blank expression and silence is not going to really help the victim at all. So it's really important to balance kind of the observer stance with that sort of compassion and empathy that the abuse victim has often lacked in their relationships. And again, they need to acknowledge that sometimes abusive behavior is malicious and intentional. I find that many counselors think that, oh, they didn't intend it. They weren't malicious. They weren't sadistic. That's one of the biggest misconceptions about narcissistic abuse and emotional abuse and psychological abuse is that people think that people are just acting out unconsciously. But this type of behavior can be very deliberately cruel and intentional, especially when you consider how quickly the mask switches and how the abuser is able to switch those masks in a second if they're being watched or if there's a witness that comes in. So that is under their conscious control, and they do abuse in order to gain a sense of power. And a validating counselor would consider that when they're hearing accounts of abuse. Another one is that an invalidating counselor will attempt to talk about the tender, loving moments in the relationship as signs that the abuser has changed, instead of acknowledging that that might be actually part of the abuse cycle of the honeymoon period and the tension and the explosion and then right back to the abuse. So counselors who really understand and are well versed in the dynamics of abuse will not try to feed the victim false hope. They will understand that abusers will rarely change. They will understand that, and they will not attempt to feed that sense of false hope that may keep the victim stuck in the relationship. They will instead try to show a lot of compassion for the victim and empathize with the victim, while also tailoring, again, the resources that will help the victim to detach from their abuser. And perhaps even the biggest one that I would mention is that despite telling your counselor that you've been narcissistically abused, the therapist makes absolutely no effort to better understand this type of abuse or learn more about personality disorders. If he or she is not informed about them or hasn't done enough research on them, they don't go out of their way to really understand where you're coming from or even try to research it. They minimize the problems in your relationships as mere conflicts. And a counselor who hears the term narcissistic abuse but does not look further into it in order to understand where the client may be coming from and going through is probably not a counselor that you want to continue with. In sessions with an invalidating therapist, you start realizing that you've spent more time in a session educating your therapist more about the narcissistic abuse you've been dealing with, rather than spending time healing from the narcissistic abuse. So in a validating therapeutic relationship, ideally what would happen is that the therapist and the client would work together and co-create this relationship that will benefit the survivor's healing. The survivor should not be doing all of the work educating the therapist. They should both be co-creating this alliance together. And a therapist should be able to guide the survivor to appropriate tools to begin to heal and process their trauma. So I hope this video helps. If you've had experiences with either a validating counselor or an invalidating counselor or both, let me know in the comment section below. I will leave the links to the articles I discussed, as well as the therapists that I've mentioned in this video, and I'll talk to you guys soon. Until then, take care.